Hi, we're looking today at the picture of Dorian Gray, at the preface, and chapter 1. Why should we read it? The picture of Dorian Gray is, yes, it's a gripping novel. It's a man selling his soul to the devil, really, in exchange for eternal youth and beauty. Why? Because he wants to enjoy a life of enjoyment and pleasure. So his painting gets older and uglier to show his soul's destruction. We could call this a gothic novel, type of novel that deals with horror, death, and sometimes romance. There's elements of fable too. It's like an adult fable. I hope you're going to enjoy it. Before the story starts, we have this preface, which is an abstract and quite difficult piece about art itself. People criticized this novel. Some of them felt it was an immoral novel. And he tries to answer such criticisms here. You'll see I've made certain things red, and really just for those of you who don't want to read or find it difficult to read through everything. So I've tried to highlight the most important things. And on this page, it's just this line: the artist is the creator of beautiful things. It's about the nature of art. A bit later, there's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. So that's answering to those who felt this novel perhaps was immoral. And here he's saying that if you're an artist, you can write or paint about everything, vice and virtue, good things and bad things. And here he says that it is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Art tells you about yourself. In the next chapter, we're going to have art showing something about the artist, but this is the idea that art's showing you something about yourself. And that preface ending with the idea that all art is quite useless. It's just there for the aesthetics, for making things look pretty. Aesthetics is the study of beauty, the philosophy of beauty. That's the end of the preface. I mentioned that word aesthetics because it's going to come up shortly. I'm just reminding you here that it's the spectator and not life that art really mirrors, Oscar Wilde felt. What is this novel going to show you about yourself? So here's a little note about aestheticism. There was this aesthetic movement about art for art's sake. And this preface became the manifesto of such a movement. We've looked at that idea. The artist creates beautiful things, no such thing as moral or immoral, either good or badly written. And an artist can write about anything. And if people disagree and argue about it, it shows that the work of art is alive. Chapter 1, our setting, and these are my notes, not Oscar Wilde's. This is London. It's a hot day, and we're going to meet this artist, Basil Hallward, and his friend, Lord Henry. We won't meet Dorian Gray in this chapter, but we will see him in the picture, in the portrait. But Oscar Wilde starts the story here. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags, the couch, on which he was lying, couch-stroke bed, smoking, as was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-coloured blossoms of a laburnum, a tree. It's going to be cut off, I'm sorry, but the dim roar of London was, what you can't see is like the bourdon, I'm not sure what bourdon, it's some kind of an organ, note of a distant organ. So, but the dim roar of London gives us our setting. This is London, but it's still a city, even back in the 1800s. In the corner of the room, clamped to an upright easel, stood the full-length portrait of a young man of extraordinary personal beauty, and in front of it, some little distance away, was sitting the artist himself, Basil Hallward, whose sudden disappearance some years ago caused, at the time, such public excitement and gave rise to so many strange conjectures, theories. This is like we're finding out what's going to happen at the end. It's like stories being told from afterwards. So we're told at the beginning that this artist, towards the end of the story, is going to disappear. Of course, we'll find out exactly what happens, if you don't already know. As the painter looked at the gracious and comely, the attractive form he had so skillfully mirrored in his art, a smile of pleasure passed across his face and seemed about to linger there. But he suddenly started up, and closing his eyes, placed his fingers upon the lids, as though he sought to imprison within his brain some curious dream from which he feared he might awake. Lord Henry says, "It is your best work, Basil, the best thing you've ever done." He says languidly, in a tired, half lazy way, the way of the upper class, wealthy and idle. "You must certainly send it next year to the Grosvenor, the art gallery. The Academy, another art gallery, is too large and too vulgar, and there's a joke coming up. Whenever I've gone there, there have been either so many people that I've not been able to see the pictures, which was dreadful, or so many pictures that I've not been able to see the people, which was worse." And what's the joke? That he really goes to art galleries to see the people and not the pictures. It's a kind of Oscar Wilde joke that we're hearing through Lord Henry. The Grosvenor is really the only place. Basil says, "I don't think I shall send it anywhere." No, I won't send it anywhere. Not send it anywhere? My dear fellow, why? What odd chaps you painters are. There's another joke coming up. You do anything in the world to catch a reputation. As soon as you have one, you seem to want to throw it away. It's silly of you, for, here's the joke, there is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. That quotation mark there is a misprint. So, yeah, it's awful to be gossiped about, but it's even worse to be ignored. And the artist's reply is, I know you will laugh at me, but I really can't exhibit it. I have put too much of myself into it. And Lord Henry is going to think he means he's made the subject of the painting look like himself, and he's going to say, no, but that's not true. You don't look like that. But that's not what he meant. Long speech of Lord Henry's here. Too much of yourself in it. Upon my word, Basil, I didn't know you were so vain, and I really can't see any resemblance between you, with your rugged, strong face and your coal-black hair, and this young Adonis, or good-looking man, who looks as if he was made out of ivory and rose leaves. Why, my dear Basil, he is a Narcissus, another word from Greek mythology meaning a good-looking man. And you, well, of course, you have an intellectual expression and all that. But I'll skip a couple lines here. He's mocking of the church even. To here, he says, your mysterious young friend, whose name you've never told me, but whose picture really fascinates me, never thinks. I feel quite sure of that. He's some brainless, beautiful creature who should be always here in winter, when we have no flowers to look at. Also, a bit cut off at the end, he says, don't flatter yourself, Basil, you're not in the least like him. But Basil didn't mean that. He says, of course I'm not like him. I know that perfectly well. I should be sorry to look like him. This is interesting what he says here. You shrug your shoulders. I'm telling you the truth. There's a fatality about all physical and intellectual distinction. In other words, if you're ahead of everyone else, either intellectually or physically, it kind of can lead to fatal things for you. What's happened to kings here? He says, it's better not to be different from one's fellows. The ugly and the stupid have the best of it in this world. They can sit at their ease and gape at the play. If they know nothing of victory, if they don't become famous, they are at least spared the knowledge of defeat. They live as we all should live, undisturbed, indifferent, and without disquiet, nothing to bother them. And he says, your rank and wealth, Harry, My brains, such as they are, my art, whatever it may be worth, Dorian Gray's good looks. We shall all suffer for what the gods have given us. Suffer terribly. You can think about that at the end of the novel. How does each of these characters suffer because what the gods have given them? How does Basil Hallward suffer because of his art? How does Dorian Gray suffer because of his looks? How does Lord Henry suffer because he interferes with everyone else? And that's where he tells the name Dorian Gray didn't want to. Dorian Gray, is that his name? Yes, I didn't intend to tell it to you, but why not? And even Basil's got some things that he hides because he says, oh, I can't explain. When I like people immensely, I never tell their names to anyone. Perhaps he's making this story up. And he says the commonest thing is delightful if one only hides it. When I leave town now, I never tell my people where I'm going. I don't believe him. I think he's making that up to disguise why he didn't want to tell the name. But Lord Henry, well, I'm not even sure how much we can take seriously of what Lord Henry says. He says, not at all. You seem to forget that I'm married. Oscar Wilde joked about marriage coming up. And the one charm of marriage is that it makes a life of deception absolutely necessary for both parties. He's saying if you get married, you're going to deceive your spouse. I never know where my wife is, and my wife never knows what I am doing. When we do meet occasionally. That's a joke because he's talking about husband and wife. When we dine out, we tell each other the most absurd stories with the most serious faces. My wife is very good at it, much better, in fact, than I am. She never gets confused over her dates, and I always do. But when she does find me out, she makes no row at all. She just laughs at me. He's bragging about this, but you'll see at the end what happens to his marriage. Basil says, I hate the way you talk about your married life, Harry. I believe that you are really a very good husband, and that you're thoroughly ashamed of your own virtues or good qualities. He says, you're an extraordinary guy. You never say a moral thing, and you never do a wrong thing. Your cynicism, your suspicion, is simply a pose. And maybe he's got the truth about Henry there. Henry says outrageous things sometimes, but does he follow his own advice? So they go out into the garden. And he asks again, why won't you exhibit the picture? I want the real reason. He says, I told you. He says, no, you did not. You said it's because there's too much of yourself in it. That's childish. And here we got the idea of the spectator. Basil says, Harry, every portrait that is painted with feeling, not the spectator, this is about the artist, is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. The way the painter paints the picture tells something about him. And he says here again, the reason I won't exhibit it is that I'm afraid that I've shown in it the secret of my own soul. It's kind of saying in a roundabout way, and eventually sort of reveal it. Henry, he says, you won't believe me. Henry says, I'm quite sure I understand it. Oscar Wilde joke coming up. And as for believing things, I can believe anything, provided that it is quite incredible. It's a joke, I believe only the most unbelievable things. And Lord Henry can feel Basil's heart beating and wondered what was coming. So Basil is nervous to say whatever he wants to say. And he tells when he met Dorian Gray for the first time at Lady Brandon's. When our eyes met, I felt that I was growing pale. A curious sensation of terror came over me, and that sounds like a Gothic novel. I knew that I'd come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. Typical Lord Henry thing to say, that conscience and cowardice are really the same things. We should really just go back and get the line about conscience. Yes, he says that this meeting Dorian was like a crisis in his life, and he felt terrible things would happen, and he wanted to run away, not out of conscience but rather out of cowardice. And that's where Lord Henry says they're actually the same thing, implying that if you don't kill someone, it's could be cowardice, could be you call it conscience, but it's actually cowardice. He's going to later on say, do whatever you want to do. Whether he takes that advice or not, we don't know. So Basil goes on with his story. Lady Brandon, he wanted to run away, and she came to ask him, "You're not going to run away so soon," in her shrill voice. And there's this kind of a joke coming, anti-woman kind of a joke. Lord Henry says, yes, she's a peacock in everything but beauty. It became a famous joke, so that's why I've highlighted it here. But that's when he sees Dorian, and our eyes met. It's reckless of me because of social mores of the time. I asked Lady Brandon to introduce him. It wasn't so reckless. It was simply inevitable. Couldn't have stopped it. We would have spoken to each other without any introduction. I'm sure of that. Dorian told me so afterwards. He too felt that we were destined to know each other. I'm skipping the bits about Lady Brandon. A nice line from Lord Henry. Laughter is not a bad beginning for a friendship. That's how they started. He playing the piano and they were laughing about something. And the best ending for one, said Lord Henry. Interesting, Basil here says, you are indifferent to everyone. You don't really care about anyone. And I should have highlighted this or made it red. He says, I choose my friends for their good looks, my acquaintances for their good characters, and my enemies for their good intellects. A man cannot be too careful in the choice of his enemies. I don't have one who's a fool. They're all men of some intellectual power, and consequently they all appreciate me. Is that very vain? Blah, blah, blah. And another joke, and of course in Victorian times people died. And he says, your brothers, I don't care for brothers. My elder brother won't die, and my younger brothers never seem to do anything else. So many of his younger brothers have died, but the one who's going to inherit the estate refuses to die. Doesn't like his relatives because we don't like seeing other people having the same faults as ourselves. How often do you see Dorian Gray? Every day. I wouldn't be happy otherwise. He's absolutely necessary to me. He's all my art to me now. I know that the work I've done since I met Dorian Gray is good work, is the best work of my life. Here we find out Dorian Gray's age, really over 20. And Basil says that this landscape that he was offered big money for, while I was painting it, Dorian Gray sat beside me. Some subtle influence passed from him to me, and for the first time in my life I saw in the plain woodland the wonder I had always looked for and always missed. Basil feels he's going to suggest a new way of art. So why won't you exhibit his portrait? He says, without intending it, I've put into it some expression of all this curious artistic idolatry. Idolatry means worshipping someone, of which, of course, I've never cared to speak to him. So he's kind of telling us, yes, he worshipped Dorian Gray, and yeah, that he didn't tell Dorian. He knows nothing about it. He shall never know anything about it, but the world might guess it. And I will not bare my soul to their shallow, prying eyes. He's scared the world will see how much he liked Dorian. He doesn't want his heart to be put under a microscope. There's too much of myself. Harry, too much of myself, too much of my soul, too much of his liking. Can we call it love for Dorian Gray? Basil says we shouldn't put anything of your own life into them. And that's why he doesn't want to exhibit the painting. Harry asks, does Dorian Gray like you? Is he fond of you? He likes me. Sometimes he irritates me. And then I feel like I've given my whole soul. When he gives me pain. Then I feel like I've given away my whole soul to someone who treats it as if I were a flower to put in his coat, a decoration. So I don't think Dorian likes Basil the way Basil likes Dorian. Henry says, oh, don't worry, you'll get tired of him. He says, someday you'll look at your friend and he'll seem to you to be a little out of drawing. You won't like his tone of color. Why? Because beauty fades. Genius lasts longer than beauty. The next time he calls, you'll be perfectly cold. The worst of having a romance of any kind is that it leaves one so unromantic. Another joke like that. These are paradoxes, Oscar Wilde paradoxes. A romance leaves you feeling unromantic. You change too often. And Lord Henry says he likes playing with other people's likes playing with other people's emotions. He misses a dinner and he doesn't mind because the rich would have spoken about saving money and the lazy would have spoken about working. And he's so pleased he missed the dinner. And Henry realizes that he remembers the name of Dorian Gray from his aunt, who had mentioned the name, but she never told him he was good looking. He says women have no appreciation of good looks, at least good women have not. He pictured really an unattractive person. I wish I'd known it was your friend. Basil says, I'm very glad you didn't. Why? I don't want you to meet him. You don't want me to meet him? No. And then that's the moment that the butler, we find out if it's the same as the valet is Victor. The butler announces Dorian Gray's in the studio. So he didn't want him to meet. He didn't even want him to know the name. But now he can't escape it because Dorian Gray has arrived. You must introduce me now. The painter tells the butler to tell Dorian to wait a few seconds. And he warns Lord Henry, Dorian Gray is my dearest friend. He has a simple and a beautiful nature. Your aunt was quite right in what she said of him. Don't spoil him. Don't try to influence him. Of course, that's exactly what Lord Henry's going to do. Your influence would be bad. The world is wide and has many marvelous people in it. Don't take away from me the one person who gives to my art, whatever charm it possesses. My life as an artist depends on him. Mind, Harry, I trust you. He spoke very slowly. He really means this. And the words seemed wrung out of him, like water out of clothing. Almost against his will. He doesn't want to say it, but he has to say it. What nonsense you talk, said Lord Henry, smiling. And taking Hallward by the arm, he almost led him into the house. And I mean, that tells us Lord Henry's taking control of the situation. He's not going to take this advice. He's going to influence poor Dorian Gray. And that's chapter 1. In summary, yes, Lord Henry, we also call him Harry. Harry is short for Henry. Basil was finishing the portrait. This is how you should quote. Best ever, no, I don't want to exhibit it. I put too much myself. Where we met, don't want to exhibit the painting. It tells too much about the artist. It tells about the soul. Dorian arrives. He warns him, your influence would be bad. So in this chapter, we've met old Basil. We've met old Henry. We're about to meet Dorian. We have our setting of Victorian London. And things are starting to move. I hope you're inspired to carry on and come back for chapter 2. Like and subscribe, please.